Some crimes don't begin with a scream. They begin with a smile. A respected businessman, a charming widower, a brilliant doctor with perfect manners. Each looked like the kind of person you'd trust with your secrets, your savings, even your life. But behind closed doors, love became leverage, and marriage became a battlefield. In Florida, a wife woke up to a knife and a husband's cold promise. In Colorado, a woman vanished from a cliff on an anniversary trip that felt scripted. And in Texas, a desperate man tried to erase the one witness who could destroy him. 3 stories. One chilling truth. The most dangerous predators rarely look dangerous at all. A golden man with an immaculate resume and fractures you couldn't see. Mike Rochelle seemed built for success. A disciplined childhood, near Eagle Scout, altar boy, fraternity brother, and later an MBA graduate. He married his first wife, Dee Hoffman, in 1979 while they were still students. Together they built a stable life, raised 2 daughters, Caroline and Kate, and from the outside, Mike looked like a dependable family man. Dee even said he never physically abused her. But the stability had a cost. Mike was constantly traveling for work, absent for long stretches, and his daughters grew up learning to live around the empty chair. A divorce that left a house, 2 daughters, and a midlife loneliness. After 25 years, Dee asked for a divorce. She moved out intentionally, so their daughters would always have a home base when returning from college. Mike stayed behind, 49 years old, newly single, and suddenly desperate to replace a life structure that had vanished. Enter Susan, the kind of whirlwind that feels like fate until it feels like a storm. In the mid-2000s, Mike joined Match.com and met Susan, a 38-year-old Hispanic nurse. Their relationship moved fast. Trips, romance, intensity. Susan soon moved into Mike's home, into the space that once belonged to Dee. Dee later described it as everything that was hers suddenly becoming Susan's, even her dog. For Caroline, the first meeting raised alarms. Susan drank multiple martinis, yet stayed eerily functional. Walking, talking, smiling. It wasn't just drinking. It felt like control. A wedding, a business, and a life that became smaller, tighter, more contained. Mike and Susan married in 2007. After the wedding, Susan stopped working and Mike stopped traveling. He bought a local business, Ocala Dental, and their world narrowed. In a wealthy neighborhood at Hiley Plantation, they joked about their perfect life. But perfection is often what people perform when they're hiding rot. The prenup that exposed the cracks. That same year, Mike drafted a prenuptial agreement, an odd move for a couple presenting as inseparable. The catalyst was ugly. At one of his daughter's house parties, Susan's temper erupted. Profanity, hostility, and a blow-up in front of Mike's daughter. Mike began thinking like a man, protecting assets from his own marriage. Money, jealousy, and the quiet war against his daughters. Susan admitted to $35,000 in credit card debt, alarming Mike. But the deepest conflict wasn't financial. It was emotional territory. Susan disliked Mike's daughters. Caroline said the only way she could truly talk to her father was alone in his car, away from Susan. That detail matters. Isolation is rarely accidental. It's often a strategy. The wedding that looked like reconciliation, but was actually a warning. In 2016, Caroline got engaged, and Susan forced herself into the center of every detail. She insisted on hosting the bridal shower, then excluded Caroline's mother's friends, replacing them with her own circle. She even paid for Caroline's $11,000 wedding dress, a gesture that looked generous but also established power. I can buy my place here. A mark on Mike's face, and the truth he delayed telling. At Caroline's lavish Long Island wedding in November 2017, she noticed a strange mark on her father's face. Mike brushed it off. 3 weeks later, he confessed it was a scar, left by Susan during a violent incident. Susan had been arrested for domestic battery after becoming violent while intoxicated. Susan claimed it started when Mike admitted the wedding went $150,000 over budget. A phone was thrown. A push. Susan called 911. A court ordered her to stay away. She sought help. Mike dropped the charges. And then, just when the drama seemed to pause, the real nightmare arrived. 4 a.m., a 911 call, and blood everywhere. On February 3rd, 2018, Mike called 911 from his Gainesville home. His voice carried the kind of forced urgency that responders learn to fear. Someone had entered the house, and Susan was bleeding badly. Police arrived to a horrific scene. Susan on the bed in the master bedroom, severely injured. Medics rushed her to the hospital. Surgeons fought to keep her alive. A crime scene that didn't match the story. Back at the house, a detective combed through the bedroom. Massive amounts of blood, a bent, bloody knife. But there was no forced entry, no shattered windows, no kicked-in doors. Security footage showed no one fleeing. That absence wasn't proof, but it was a problem. If an intruder came in, where did the intruder go? Susan survives and flips the entire narrative. Susan lived, and when she regained consciousness, she told detectives the most devastating sentence possible. There was no intruder. Mike did it. Her account was brutal. They argued at dinner, then drove home separately. She went to bed. As she drifted off, she felt stabbing pain. She opened her eyes and saw Mike standing over her with a knife. She screamed, "Michael, you're going to kill me." He replied, "That's exactly what I want to do." She said she lay bleeding for an hour. Mike allegedly told her he wouldn't kill her if she agreed to his plan. Claim an intruder broke in. She agreed out of survival. He changed clothes, staged the scene, and called 911 with the performance ready. Mike's arrest shocks the people who thought they knew him. Mike was arrested for attempted murder. The community recoiled. Dee couldn't reconcile the man she knew with the accusation. Caroline and Kate were stunned. They saw their father as generous and gentle. But prosecutors added more charges: false imprisonment, obstruction, and evidence tampering. Bond was set at $2.5 million on additional charges, but no bond for attempted murder. Then the case darkened further, a murder-for-hire allegation. Months later, on June 29, 2018, Mike was arrested again, this time accused of trying to hire an inmate to kill Susan. The charge: solicitation and conspiracy related to a capital felony. Another man, Roderick Jermaine McCallum, was implicated. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from domestic chaos to calculated elimination. Trial testimony paints a marriage built on fear and control, depending on who you believe. Mike described a turbulent marriage, limited visitors, Susan controlling who could enter their home, threats of divorce if he attended meetings or donated to charity. He described her spending, clothes, jewelry, unchecked. He claimed Susan was violent. A wine bottle thrown downstairs, heavy mugs, vases. He said he documented injuries and even sent pictures to Caroline. Yet he insisted he loved Susan and wanted to stay married, while admitting he walked on eggshells. Two versions of the stabbing, both impossible to fully reconcile. Susan described a direct attack. Mike entered, stabbed her, slashed her wrists, sliced her thumb, and told her he'd lie with her until she died. Mike claimed he found her holding a knife. They struggled, fell onto the bed, and she was injured accidentally. But the neck wound? The thumb injury? Those details hovered like ghosts over his explanation. And then came the strangest detail of all. Mike said they lay together for hours, having one of the best conversations of their lives, talking about future travel plans: Germany, Tuscany, Florence, Greece, while according to prosecutors, the bed was soaked with blood, vomit, and human waste. That wasn't just odd. It was surreal, and it made one question unavoidable. If this was an accident, why did it look like a story being written in real time? The cameras, the lies, and the problem with protective deception. One piece kept coming back like a drumbeat. Mike admitted he turned off security cameras to stage a break-in, then later turned them back on and called 911. He framed it as protection. Susan feared being arrested, so he lied to save her. But prosecutors saw a different meaning. If you're innocent, you don't need choreography. Science enters the courtroom. Blood doesn't care about personality. A bloodstain pattern analyst testified for the defense, arguing that medical records suggested Susan's timeline could not be true. If her wrists were cut around 10 p.m., she would have bled out before help arrived. Under Mike's version, she survived because assistance came sooner. That testimony didn't prove innocence, but it complicated certainty. It gave jurors a puzzle. Susan's story felt vivid, but did biology support it? The prosecution's counterstrike: motive and hypocrisy. Prosecutors challenged Mike's claim he wanted reconciliation by presenting evidence he had visited 3 dating sites, suggesting he wasn't clinging to love, he was scanning exits. The defense countered by showing he accessed resources about battered husbands, suggesting he saw himself as a victim. Victim, protector, manipulator, liar, loving husband, attempted murderer. In court, Mike became a shapeshifter depending on which exhibit was on the screen. The case isn't just who stabbed, it's who controlled reality afterward. The terrifying center of this trial wasn't only the knife. It was the aftermath, the demand for an intruder story, the management of cameras, the carefully arranged narrative, and the alleged later attempt to have Susan killed. Because that's what separates panic from predation. Panic produces chaos. Predation produces plans. The jury deliberates and returns fast. After a 9-day trial, the jury deliberated only about 4 hours before delivering their verdict, guilty of attempted first-degree murder and additional charges. For Mike, the conviction wasn't just punishment, it was a collapse of identity. The scout, the altar boy, the businessman, the father, none of it protected him in the final accounting. Sentencing, support, loyalty, and the strange endurance of denial. In December 2019, Mike was sentenced. Susan did not attend. Caroline spoke to the court with pride in being his daughter. Friends described him as kind and gentle, a stand-up gentleman. That support is one of the darkest realities of certain crimes. People don't just mourn the victim. They mourn the version of the accused they believed was real. Prosecutors sought 50 years. The judge imposed 30. Given Mike's age, he would likely die in prison. But as one marriage story ended in a courtroom, another story, older, colder, stranger, was waiting. Because in Colorado, a widower had already perfected the role of grieving husband. And his wife hadn't just died. She fell. Tony, the tomboy Southern belle who built a life on discipline and faith. Tony Barrelett grew up the only girl between brothers, tough enough to hold her own, charming enough to light a room. She became an ophthalmologist, respected and compassionate, top of her class. Her first marriage failed, leaving her lonely but not broken. When she returned to dating, she chose a Christian dating site, hoping faith would filter out danger. That's where she met Harold Henthorne. Harold's profile was polished, handsome, charming, a consultant for a nonprofit, a widower whose first wife, Lynn, died in a car accident. He spoke of second chances. He spoke of destiny. Tony believed him. They married quickly, moved to Colorado, had a daughter, Haley, and built a life that looked steady. The anniversary trip that felt like a gift and later felt like a setup. In September 2012, Harold arranged a surprise 12th anniversary trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. He booked the Stanley Hotel, famous, eerie, the inspiration for The Shining. He mapped trails. He organized childcare. It felt thoughtful. It felt romantic. And it felt, later, too planned. A fall, a fire, and a response that didn't feel like desperation. On September 29th, just before 7 p.m., Harold called 911. Tony fell off a cliff. He begged for a helicopter. He hung up to save battery. He called again, then hung up again. Arranger navigated triche terrain. Harold built a fire to help them find him. When help arrived, over 2 hours later, Tony was dead. Harold told a story, crowded trail, they sought seclusion, lunch at the mountain, then Tony tried photographing turkeys and fell 128 feet. But whispers began almost immediately. Tony had nearly died 1 year earlier when a beam fell and struck her head while Harold was nearby. Harold seemed distracted at her funeral, more interested in football than grief. A ranger later said Harold showed no indication he performed CPR. The FBI pulls the thread and finds a pattern. The FBI uncovered Harold's phone pinged in the area of Tony's fall 9 times before her death, suggesting scouting. Then came the most chilling revelation. Toni wasn't Harold's first wife to die. Lynn, wife number 1, died in 1995. Harold claimed a jack failed while changing a tire, and Lynn was trapped under the car. Witnesses said Harold seemed oddly evasive, not urgent, even disappointed when EMTs restarted her heart. Lynn later died at the hospital. Autopsy suggested asphyxiation, yet it was ruled accidental. A private investigator later found Harold told conflicting stories. Lynn searching for a lug nut or retrieving a flashlight. They were headed to dinner or already ate. Trunk fell on her neck or cancer, depending on who he spoke to. A woman can forget details in trauma. A liar changes details to fit the audience. The nonprofit consultant who didn't work and the business trips to Panera Bread. Investigators couldn't find evidence Harold held a job since 1995. No tax returns, no pay stubs. His work trips were spent at Panera Bread, surfing the internet. What was he doing? And why did so much of his life rely on stories no one verified? By 2014, he was arrested for Toni's murder. And in 2015, the jury saw a map in his car, marked with a giant X on the spot where Toni fell. Some places aren't just locations. They're selections. These cases aren't just about violence. They're about performance. What connects these stories isn't only blood. It's image management. Mike Rochelle built a reputation so clean it blinded people to the possibility of cruelty. Harold Henthorne built a persona so charming it turned suspicion into sympathy. And Layan Jacob, wealthy, educated doctor, used professional knowledge to design death like a procedure. The ugliest truth is this. Some predators don't overpower you with strength. They overpower you with credibility. Domestic violence doesn't always look like the stereotype. In Mike and Susan's story, each side accused the other of violence. There were arrests, restraining orders, counseling, dropped charges. The danger was not only the physical harm. It was the constant reshaping of reality. When someone controls access to family, controls finances, controls who enters the home, and turns every conflict into a crisis, relationships become prisons. And when a crime happens inside that prison, outsiders don't know where truth begins. That's why cases like this can feel impossible. The public wants a clean villain. Real life gives messy dynamics, and then one night, the mess turns fatal. Accidents are the favorite weapon of the patient killer. Harold's case highlights a terrifying principle. If death looks accidental, investigations are slower, blame is softer, and mourning becomes a shield. A fall, a tir accident, a beam, a cliff, nature, bad luck. But when bad luck repeats around the same person, it stops being luck. It becomes a signature. The Texas plot reveals the coldest form of entitlement, eliminating a human being like a problem. Layan Jacob allegedly didn't just want Megan gone. He wanted her erased because she threatened his image and freedom. He discussed potassium chloride, clinical, calculated, using access through Valerie's veterinary clinic. And Valerie, desperate for love, vulnerable, possibly manipulated, became collateral damage in his plan. Her suicide after release is the kind of tragic coda that exposes how predators destroy more than the target. They destroy everyone orbiting them. Society must stop mistaking charm for safety. These cases should force one harsh lesson. Being likable is not a moral credential. A polished resume is not evidence of empathy. A confident smile can be the final warning sign, not reassurance. When courts convict someone like Mike or Harold, communities often resist because it feels like losing faith in their own judgment. But that discomfort is exactly where the danger lives. The reluctance to believe the nice guy could be capable of horror. The moral indictment. If you build a life on deception, manipulation, and control, violence is not an incident. It's the inevitable endpoint of entitlement. These men didn't just harm women. They tried to control the narrative, the evidence, the witnesses, and the world's perception. And that is what makes them truly condemning. They didn't only attack bodies. They attacked truth. Behind the best smiles were the worst intentions. stage break-ins, scripted accidents, and murder plots dressed as love stories. These cases prove one brutal reality. Danger often arrives wearing respectability. When control becomes the goal, someone always bleeds. And sometimes, the mask survives longer than the victim.